This is Andrew, and this is Keen On, the daily now.tv chat show with some of the world's leading thinkers and writers. Hello, everybody. How are we going to make sense, summarize the 2020s? One way of doing it is to describe our age as the age of not of information, but of misinformation. We never seem to be able to trust anything we see. And so many of today's scandals and issues in the media reflect our age of misinformation. We're all familiar, of course, with the stories about Taylor Swift fakes, more and more stories about AI-generated content creating one kind of fake image or another. No one can trust what they see or hear or watch. There's a Beverly Hills middle school which is investigating students sharing AI-made nude photos of classmates that aren't really, of course, the nude photos of classmates. And last week, Google was involved in a huge controversy after its AI-generated Gemini spat out inaccurate images. When we can't trust what we see, of course, the implications for politics are profound. My guest today has done a lot of thinking about this. Sasha Issenberg had a book out a few years ago, The Victory Lab, The Secret Science of Winning Campaigns, which is a book about how to win political campaigns in our age of information, or our age, in fact, of disinformation. And he has a new book out today, The Lie Detectives, in Search of a Playbook for Winning Elections in the Disinformation Age. The real Sasha Issenberg is joining us from the real Venice in Southern California. Beautiful place, just on the edge of Los Angeles. Sasha, do you think we live in the age of disinformation? Is that a way to summarize the 2020s?
I think we're certainly feel like we're in the beginning period of an era that's not going to end anytime soon, where I think there are a few factors that have come together to make it that way. One is that the barriers to creating and disseminating information at scale have lowered significantly. So if you go back to the middle of the 20th century, if you wanted to reach a large number of people, you needed to have access to a printing press or a broadcast signal. Those were regulated and costly. You often had to be pretty close to the people that you were trying to reach. What has happened now, obviously, is that anybody can log on to any number of platforms and pretty quickly and at close to zero cost create content that can ripple out without any sort of oversight or accountability. So that's what's happening on one end. And then at the same time, a lot of the institutions in certainly American life, but I think in a lot of our peer countries too, that helped govern sort of common shared understandings of what was true, what was reliable, what was credible. That's government, that's academia, that's the media, that's religious institutions, that's what we might call civil society. Those are almost every one of those institutions is weaker now in terms of public esteem. And so when lies do circulate, there are far fewer people or institutions whose word about that is trusted by citizens.
And there's one thing that you didn't add, Sasha, that I'd be curious as to your opinion on. Well, all that's true. We increasingly don't trust the dominant institutions of what we once called the information age, newspapers, political institutions, perhaps even religious, certainly educational institutions. The one thing that's remained constant is we seem to still trust ourselves. Is there some truth to that? What's happened to the self in terms of how they perceive the world? Has something shifted there too?
Probably. I mean, this is sort of my amateur psychology, anthropology, epistemology here, but I think some reason that people are so willing to adopt not just views on individual facts, but on whole parts of the human experience that are at odds with sort of demonstrated truth, is because they have developed the confidence that they know better than the CDC or about whether a vaccine is credible or not. And so, people have talked about the death of expertise, and I think that the flip side of that probably is a lot of people thinking that they are experts in what are often pretty technical and arcane matters. How mRNA works is not something that the average layperson should in any way be expected or counted on to understand. Frankly, how votes are processed or tallied at the county level in the state you don't live in is not something that the average citizen could be expected to understand. And instead of trusting in others who are credible to interpret and explain those complex phenomena, I think there are a lot of people, and this is probably empowered by the easy access to any information, including like the information of your choosing online. People think that they are able to navigate it themselves.
Yeah, we got Tom Nichols who wrote about the death of the expert 10 years ago. His book, he's been on the show before. His book's being reissued. In an odd way, then, we're living in this sort of late stage Cartesian period where everything around us is untrustworthy, but we increasingly trust ourselves. So there's this sharp division between ourselves and the world. How is that playing out in politics? Does that explain the rise of men like Donald Trump? You've written about this implicitly or otherwise in two of these books, the new book Lie Detector and also Victory Lab.
Yeah, I mean, I guess we could say that it's not as though citizens don't trust in anybody. There are a lot of people who trust in political leaders, media figures, influencers. Donald Trump is one example, to interpret the world for them. Those are just people who either don't have the ability to do that on complex topics, or whose motives or incentives are to not be honest. But what's happened is that the folks who are on the other side of that equation, if we're talking about Donald Trump, it's Joe Biden's campaign or the Democratic Party, candidates at every level, party committees, super PACs, labor unions, whoever is engaging in political communication, now finds that their opposition is often not another candidate like Trump, but are individuals, sometimes spreading lies because they can make money off of them, sometimes spreading lies just to create chaos or mayhem online. Sometimes these are foreign figures who are outside of the bounds of American law. Sometimes they're doing so at the behest of a foreign government. These are people who, on one hand, you have, if you're a legitimate political actor, if you're a candidate, if you're a party committee, if you're a super PAC, whatever, you have to abide by a whole lot of rules about, at the very least, disclosing how and when you communicate and where you spend money. Most of these other actors don't have to do that. There is a certain amount of accountability when you put something in a television ad that runs over the public airwaves, for example. But these sort of illegitimate political actors are not constrained by any of that. And so this new book is very much about that asymmetry and how the traditional political campaign was defined, and the sort of quest for innovation that I wrote about in the Victory Lab was defined by these two more or less equally matched parties, the Democrat and Republican candidate, for example, who were trying to each get better at what they were doing, but under the same constraints as their opponent. And now increasingly, campaigns are trying to communicate against an opponent who is not constrained by the same factors that they are. And that includes shame and some general sense of like what you can get away with saying in public life without repercussions. And that asymmetry is incredibly vexing for the people who are making decisions every day about what their candidate should say, what they have to respond to, how they should be trying to make news.
Would it be fair then to say that and we can see this perhaps in the persons of Biden and Trump, that the Democratic Party is still, even though it's still it's in the business of advertising its ideas and candidates, is a 20th century party, and the Republicans are a 21st century party. So the Democrats remain in the information age, whereas, for better or worse, the Republicans have embraced and perhaps even compounded our age of disinformation.
I think that's certainly true when you look at party elites. I think that right now Republican officials are far more willing to, frankly, either outright lie consciously or feel far less obligation to hew to a whole bunch of norms and standards about what political speech sounded like. I think the bigger shift is one that's probably invisible to most citizens, or sort of not fully understood, which is that what defined 20th century campaigns was a sense of control, a real like command and control mentality among the people who communicated on behalf of a candidate or a party. And so they spent most of their money on TV ads or on things like direct mail, where if you were raising a bunch of money, you were spending some of it on polling and on focus groups, on policy development, on research, and you went through a process of refining how you sold your candidate and his or her experience and your proposals and what you said about your opponent and how you responded to the things that they might say about you. And then you refine those messages and you put them in these perfect 30-second capsules on TV or radio, or a glossy flyer that went out in the mail. And your candidate said those things from a podium, and you communicated that way. And then when you had supporters who wanted to help you, you used them for, some version of menial tasks. They knocked on doors, they stuffed envelopes, whatever. But you didn't speak through them. What Trump did was recognize the kind of that the internet had enabled not only him to spout off at any hour of the day with whatever half-baked thought went through his head, but that he could encourage and amplify supporters of his to do the same. And so, if you go back to the 2016 campaign, Hillary Clinton basically used the internet largely as a new set of platforms on which she could do the same type of things she was doing on the old platforms. So putting out videos and other content, and maybe the aesthetics were slightly more casual for the internet, but by and large, it was the same measured, prepared.
And it reflected her personality. It was intensely conservative, plodding, which annoys lots of people, both on the left and the right.
Yes, and it was,
and it was also dishonest, because just as Trump lies about everything, Hillary Clinton comes from a family of equally accomplished liars.
And part of what traditional campaigns did was use the centralized speech to at least maintain consistency on
right. So it's a sort of a top-down centralized lying versus an anarchic bottom-up lying, the Clinton versus Trump model. In moral terms, of course, progressives, and you know this better than I do, Sasha, are outraged by this new model. But could one argue that it's the logical development of 20th century political advertising that, of course, was invented and pioneered in the 1920s and 30s in the United States by advertising people?
So I think that we should probably make a distinction. It's a hard one to articulate and police exactly where the line is, but between, yes, politicians have always lied, or they've often exaggerated through emphasis. Politicians have never been in the foremost job of telling the truth. But there were all sorts of controls and constraints on what, let's say in the election context, political figures thought that they could get away with. So, local television stations have a license from the FCC. They respond to letters from lawyers taking issue with things that they advertise. And so candidates cannot get away with saying anything they want in a 30-second ad on TV, because pretty quickly a letter comes from the other side's lawyers that raises questions about some factual issues, and the thing gets taken down out of the conservatism of the station to not expose itself to litigation, for example. Frankly, political consultants who are not always thought of as quite reasonably, I think, as great guardians of the moral order, still there was a reputational cost to being seen as egregious liars. And so politicians, both candidates, elected officials, and the people who ran their campaigns really lived in fear that they would wake up the next morning and the Washington Post would call them a liar. That was not something, Donald Trump takes that as a stamp of approval. But traditional political figures did not. And so there were a whole set of costs that offset the obvious benefits to being reckless with truth. And I think that for many politicians, certainly not all, those costs have diminished and the benefits have only grown because you now have all these platforms, ways of reaching voters that do not have the normal sort of checks and balances around speech, and have far less accountability and visibility from the public, from journalists. And what Trump did in 2016 was he brought his most anarchic supporters effectively into the campaign by retweeting, sharing, amplifying their posts.
And Sasha, if he was a man of the left, or claimed to be a man of the left, and perhaps said more appropriate things in terms of the progressive agenda, wouldn't we be celebrating him as a democratizer, as an agent of the anti-establishment?
I think on the process side, yes. I mean, there are people on the left who have political activists who have complained. We're now, probably going on the second decade of this, that Democrats have not committed enough to what they call digital organizing, which is basically using the internet.
Which is digital disinformation, right?
Well, so I mean, their high-minded view is that Democrats have been sort of too controlling, too centralized in their communication, and that they should do more to empower their supporters. Trump, just from a process perspective, realized that vision. He brought his supporters into parts of the political process, empowered and trusted them in ways that traditional Democratic progressive politicians never did. So I do think that there is something to that in terms of how he used the internet, and I think that there are a lot of people on the Democratic side trying to figure out how they can apply some of the concepts that were at work in sort of how Trump uses the internet to their candidates. On the truth side, I mean, I have a chapter in this book that is set in Alabama during the 2017 special election for Senate. So to jog people's memories over like the century-long last 7 years we've lived through. Jeff Sessions was named to Trump's cabinet. There was an opening in the Senate seat. Doug Jones was the Democrat, and Roy Moore, who was an convincingly alleged pedophile, was the Republican nominee. This was immediately after Trump's victory. It was the first election that Democrats had after 2016 to start working through the new political environment that they were in. And there was a lot of money being sort of sprayed out to projects to try new things in Alabama. And I tell the story of a few of these projects that were clearly intentional disinformation projects. One created this sort of false flag operation that looked like a pro-temperance or prohibition activist group that wanted to keep dry counties in Alabama. A bunch of progressive activists created this sort of fake front-looking group to make it seem as if all these old guard prohibitionists were supporting Roy Moore, and then use Facebook advertising to try to put ads that looked as though they were from this fake organization in front of moderate Republicans who would theoretically be aghast at this. There was another initiative that created basically the appearance of Russian bots and trolls following Roy Moore en masse, so that journalists would write stories that suggested that Roy Moore was being supported by a Russian intelligence operation, the way Trump had been a year earlier. What happened was when it came out that both of these these projects had received money from Reid Hoffman, the LinkedIn founder, who's become one of the most important donors in Democratic progressive politics. There was a huge internal. I mean, there was the media swarmed it, pointing out the hypocrisy of people who called out Trump's disinformation, doing it for their own benefit. And what happened was that Hoffman retreated very quickly, basically apologized, and set some sort of standard as to what he wanted his money to go to in the future. Because Hoffman was remains such a central figure in Democratic politics, that has become a sort of de facto prohibition on this type of intentional misinformation work by progressive entities.
And of course, Reid Hoffman is not just a Democratic donor, but a founder of LinkedIn and one of the PayPal mafia central in that. So he understands digital as well as anyone. We're speaking with Sasha Issenberg, the author of The Lie Detectors, a very, very important new book. I want to thank our friends at Liberties, the quarterly journal of culture and politics that deals with a lot of the complicated, ironic, controversial issues of our disinformation age, for bringing us such high quality guests as Sasha Issenberg. Going to run a short piece on Liberties, and then we'll be back with Sasha to talk more about our age of disinformation and whether or not one can indeed win elections in such a strange, weird age. So don't go away, anyone. We're watching you all.
Beyond the news, the noise, there is nuance, insight. Liberties is not just a journal of ideas. It's a meteor of intelligent substance. It's the place to be for engaged citizens. Politics, opinion, substance. Liberties is a triumph for freedom of thought. A quarterly of urgency, of cultural exploration, of intellectual delight, of immaculate prose. It's invaluable. Subscribe now or find Liberties at your favorite bookseller.
And you can subscribe to Liberties at libertiesjournal.com. We're speaking with Sasha Issenberg, one of the few remaining trustworthy journalists, top down guys in America, has a important new book out today. It's not the Victory Lab. It's the follow-up in some ways to the Victory Lab. It is The Lie Detectors, which is a fascinating book about our new age of disinformation. The subtitle of it, Sasha, I don't need me to tell you this, is In Search of a Playbook for Winning Elections in the Disinformation Age. That implies a couple of things. Firstly, that there'll still be elections. But secondly, the idea of a playbook, does playbook, Sasha, suggest that politics will remain in some ways top down? Isn't even the idea of a playbook rather a 20th century notion? Should we be thinking of it in other terms?
Yeah. So, I mean, I'm writing about people who are searching for sort of a set of tools and techniques, tactics, strategies for campaigning now, and they have uncovered some important things. I think none of them feel particularly satisfied that they have mastered how to navigate disinformation coming at them or their candidates or parties. So I think this is very much this is something that's going to be going on for quite a while, and a lot of it is going to change year to year, month to month, in part because so much is reliant on how the individual social media platforms decide to design and implement their content policies. And so to the extent that I think you're right to be, they're probably looking as much for instinct and muscle memory that they can share as a playbook per se. But I think that what they are hoping to come away with is an idea about how to make smarter tactical and strategic decisions in the moment that are not shaped by the kind of 20th century playbook that consists of a lot of assumptions that were built on that kind of centralized media age and the appeals to authority that no longer exist, and are trying to figure out.
So there is still, you're sort of dancing around this one, and I understand because there doesn't seem to be a clear answer. is the notion of a playbook still appropriate? What are political consultants, the smart political consultants, because you've talked to many of them in the lie detectives. These are in some ways, I guess, the lie detectives. Do they still talk about playbooks? Is there another way of thinking about politics and winning elections in the disinformation age?
Yeah, I mean, I write about somebody created something called a harm index. Somebody created something called a threat matrix. But these are all sort of similar ideas when you're dealing with disinformation, which is that the first there's more disinformation than anybody should know what to do with. And I think one of the problems of this era is that the media is newly focused on this problem, but often does not know how to talk about any particular example of it in proportion. And so, you now have disinformation beat reporters at TV networks and newspapers. And for them, a lot of the job is, let's find an outrageous thing that was said in some corner of the internet that,
Yeah, or as some of the stories I led with about the school in Beverly Hills investigating students sharing AI-made nude photos. That was from NBC News, a classic television kind of story.
And there's a sort of flattening effect to this, in part because we often don't know when something goes online how it's moved, how many people have seen it. Some of this is because the platforms don't give us a lot of visibility into how stuff is shared. So in part because there are ways in which the internet doesn't necessarily reveal, who's actually seeing something. Are those images being seen by students in the school? Are they being seen by people outside the school? Those are sort of questions that probably aren't easily answered by anyone. But I think the incentives for journalists are to write about every instance of this and to sort of trump it up, no pun intended there. And what happens, and that, I guess that's all well and good for NBC News. The problem is if you're a campaign that is trying to figure out which of these you have to respond to, all cases of misinformation, disinformation are not alike. Ones that are, reaching people in the state in which you're running are going to be far more important to you than ones that are reaching people in other states or in other countries. Ones that are, circulating among people who are not of voting age are probably not a concern for you. More urgently, are these just lies that are being circulated by people who already oppose you and are just coming up with new things that they imagine they dislike about you? This is, a lot of the disinformation online that gets sort of plucked out by media coverage is, to take the Taylor Swift Super Bowl example is, probably a lot of the people who indulged, whether by sharing, repeating the conspiracy theory that I guess Davos and Pfizer got Taylor Swift to date a player and then made the Chiefs win the Super Bowl to help Biden, if I follow it. But most of those are probably people who don't like Biden to begin with. They probably don't like Taylor Swift to begin with. The question for Joe Biden's campaign is this getting in front of the voters we consider persuadable? And how do we deal with it then? And so a lot of the consultants that I write about the most who are to the extent that there's a playbook, these are the people who are sort of writing it in real time, are trying to talk about these things on a threat matrix, which is, one, is this actually persuasive to people? There are a lot of crazy things that people say online that don't actually move political opinions. And is this going to harm you among the voters you care about? Either the opinions of swing voters. Is it going to, demoralize your own supporters whom you want to be donors and volunteers? And that's the starting point for deciding even when to respond to it. And so the thing that probably the most important thing that these consultants have taught campaign decision makers over the last 7 years in a gradual way is how often they should just ignore a lie online, because actively responding to it can be at times just a distraction from the things that they want to be talking about, and sometimes counterproductive because you end up drawing attention and possibly amplifying something you don't want people to see by just engaging with it.
Sasha, can democracy coexist or survive in the disinformation age? The real masters of our disinformation age seem to be more influenced by Lenin than by Jefferson or Madison. I think of somebody like Steve Bannon, who's a genius, it would seem, at disinformation. I mean, he's a Leninist. It may be no surprise that these people have a cult of Vladimir Putin. Can democracy survive? I mean, you write about these consultants and looking for a playbook, but it's all really about just pure lying in an age where no one trusts anything or any image or anyone outside themselves. So what's the fate of democracy? Is it already essentially dead?
And that might be premature, but I do think you're right to signal that that sort of core deliberative functions of liberal democracy are hard to sustain in an era where there's sort of no shared truth. I mean, we may have jumped to the end of the story with the election denial, which is obviously, hard to sustain any sort of democracy that's based on, or just the procedural parts of democracy, if people will not actually share a common understanding and respect for the results. And there are a number of Republicans, including Trump, who've basically made clear the extent to which their supposed skepticism about elections that they lose is a purely instrumental tool. And so, that they are explicitly casting doubt on elections because they're losing them, not because they actually have reason to doubt the integrity of the process.
It's the McConnell playbook, which of course is just closed. We did a show on him last week too, in which he's certainly a man of the past now.
It is, and so I think we're right to be skeptical of about fearful about where democracy is headed. With that, I would say that it is possible to imagine some of the incentives for political officials snapping back to some degree. I don't think it's necessarily fated that we will lose. It's probably not a great time to be optimistic about the future of newspapers, for example. But I think it is possible that we could have some sort of return of certain types of elite institutions that could create internal incentives for political actors.
How's that going to come, Sasha? A couple of weeks ago, the Supreme Court listening to a case about whether or not the social media platforms have the right to police their own content. Is this going to come from new media institutions, new media platforms? Is it going to come from AI? Is it going to come from aggressive government regulation?
So I think there are some possibilities of government regulation. It is one of the few areas where right now in Washington you could possibly see some sort of cross-partisan consensus. And the big talk among the people who want to rein in big tech. I mean, I guess there's some talk about anti-monopoly practices, but the other place is Section 230 of the 96 telecommunications bill, and which
but the court punted on that one last year. So
and look, I don't think this is a good time to be the person predicting that Congress is going to do anything substantive on policy, but that is a place where you could imagine legislation that at least shifts some responsibility, legal responsibility, onto online companies
although the scenario, you could argue that if that happened, the scenario would be even worse because you can't get rid of the dark web, so everyone would simply go there.
Yeah, no, I think that's like a million unintended consequences, and it would, all it would start to do probably is just open up lots of litigation, and that litigation could end in better regulation or quite possibly worse regulation. But I think that is a place where you could see government take a stronger role. I'd also note that the sort of platforms have moved somewhat in parallel over the last few years about how they see their responsibilities with content moderation. And it hasn't all been in one direction. There was a sort of push in 2018-19 among the platforms, Facebook, then Twitter, others, to at least make a show of that they were taking seriously complaints about election disinformation and frankly moderation of other things on their platforms that have nothing to do with politics, child pornography, drug dealing.
Sasha, is it possible we're all a bit hysterical and this is actually going to end reasonably well? Last time you were on the show, you were talking about the success of same-sex marriage. Your last book, the one between Victory Lab and lie detectors, was The Engagement, America's quarter-century struggle over same-sex marriage. In the 1950s, the idea that people would openly accept gay marriage was unthinkable. Now it's unthinkable to question it. Even the Trump people don't seem to doubt that one. Is it possible that over the next 30 or 40 years, the new norm of our disinformation age will establish new conventions, new ways of thinking about politics and trust and truth?
I think it's certainly possible, and probably beyond my capacity as a philosopher to anticipate.
Well, you've given a lot of thought to this stuff. You as
look, I think
knowledgeable as anyone about it.
I think that culture and systems respond and contort themselves, and so I very much here wrote a snapshot of that focuses on what the last sort of 6 years in campaign politics has been. But I think that the consequences, unintended and intended, of various actions that the players are taking now is, I went to Brazil for a week of reporting before the first round of voting in 2022. Brazil has the most aggressive election regulator in the world. There's been a political demand and a sort of legal constitutional authority that's been cobbled together that turns this, that's the Supreme Electoral Court of Brazil, into a regulator, judge, enforcer of incredibly strict policies about what can or can't be said online. There's a lot about it that's pretty scary for people who believe in liberal democracy. But this is an example of a country that, for the last 40 years at least, highly values its participatory democracy, and the turn that it has taken has been, in response to many of the same trends that we've seen in the US, has been to empower, or at least allow, a part of its court system to play a central role policing speech online. And so I wouldn't begin to anticipate where things would lead. You also, I would just pick up on one thing that you said offhandedly at the end about AI. I think that there are, I think that it's now vogue to talk apocalyptically about how AI will contribute to the sort of decay of a shared truth in our politics and otherwise. And I think there's all sorts of reason to, see already what's happened with deep fakes and look at that. There are also a lot of people who are optimistic that AI tools can help with the work of spotting, discerning, tracking, measuring online disinformation that has been one of the big challenges thus far even among those social media companies or others who want to actually enforce content moderation policies. It's costly. It's difficult to make decisions at scale, systematically deal with appeals. And so I think that there are some reasons to be cautiously hopeful that technology that obviously in certain ways has facilitated these laws can also be a thing that helps track.
Yeah, so there is some chink of hope. The book's already been very well reviewed. The Kirkus review suggested a provocative book, but dispiriting. To make it less dispiriting, what can we do? I mean, if we're not involved on the front lines of these elections, what can ordinary American voters do? Should they be reading the New York Times and the Wall Street Journal and the Washington Post and reading books by guys like you? And you're fighting disinformation, Sasha? What can citizens do?
Yeah, and your local newspaper. But
there aren't any local newspapers left. That's the problem, isn't it?
No, this is a vicious cycle we're in. Yes, I think read credible news organizations. There are some good fact checking sites online. I think the general thing would be take a second and be slow to share or repeat things online that sound too good to be true, that flatter your existing.
Should we be switching off not just Fox, but MSNBC and Facebook and Twitter?
I think to view them skeptically. I think not to view them as reliable. Not to take everything you hear equally. I mean, I think we're all sort of conditioned to do this. We all have, decades ago, we realized that the crazy guy at the end of the bar was not as trustworthy as your high school civics teacher. And we calibrated what we heard from those two parties. It didn't mean that we took everything that one said as indisputable gospel and the other as always lying, but we weighed and probably would check something that the loud barfly said in a different way than we would our civics teacher. And I think that type of skepticism and vigilance should be applied to everything we consume. And then that means MSNBC, and that means what we see posted, and we should think about who's behind it and what their motivations might be for spreading it, and why you as a consumer might be inclined to believe something that you should be skeptical about.
Maybe another way of thinking of it, Sasha, is rather than go to the bar, go to church.
Yeah. Sasha Issenberg telling you to